Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. Christmas had always been complicated in my family. Not in a dramatic, movie-style way. No screaming matches, no sudden bursts of emotion. It was more subtle than that. A lingering tension, an unspoken rule about who mattered and who didn't. And this year, I was about to find out exactly where I stood. I had done everything right. Bought gifts early. Spent weeks picking out the perfect ones for my parents, my brother Jacob, his wife Kelly, and their kids. I even grabbed extra presents for unannounced visitors, because I had convinced myself that this year would be different. I was wrong. The moment my mother opened the door, I knew something was off. She didn't greet me with the usual awkward hug, didn't even step aside to let me in. She just stood there, blocking the doorway, her expression carefully blank. And then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "We don't want you here this year." For a second, I thought she was joking. I let out a short laugh, expecting her to break into a smile, to tell me she was messing with me. But then I heard Jacob's voice behind her. "This is no place for losers." His words landed like a slap. I froze, gripping the bags of gifts in my hands, my mind struggling to catch up. Losers. I had never considered myself particularly successful, but I wasn't struggling. I had a steady job, paid my bills, and lived comfortably. And yet, here was Jacob, a man I had financially supported for years, calling me a loser? I glanced at my father, standing awkwardly in the background, avoiding eye contact. He wasn't going to defend me. Neither was my mother. And Jacob? He stood there, arms crossed, smirking like he had been waiting for this moment. I felt a storm of emotions, humiliation, confusion, rage. But I swallowed them down. "Fine," I said, my voice even. "If that's how you feel." And then, I turned around and walked back to my car. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the bags of gifts in the passenger seat. No place for losers. The words replayed in my head, over and over, like a scratch on a record. I had spent years helping Jacob, paid for his kids' summer camp, covered school supplies, and even bailed him out of his mortgage once when he was in danger of losing his home. And now, suddenly, I wasn't good enough to be part of Christmas. I wasn't needed anymore, so I was disposable. I reached for the ignition. Then I stopped. I needed answers. I left the gifts in the car and walked back to the house. This time, I didn't wait for an invitation. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My parents were still standing in the hallway, talking in hushed voices. Jacob was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Why am I not welcome at Christmas?" Jacob didn't even look up when he answered. "You really don't get it, do you?" He let out a small chuckle, finally meeting my gaze. "You've been slacking off lately. The kids barely got anything from you this year." I stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about? I spent hundreds on gifts for your kids. They have more presents in the car than anyone else." Jacob shrugged. "Last year, you did more. This year, it's like you don't care. It's embarrassing for us, honestly. Embarrassing. For them. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I hadn't given enough." I turned to my parents, expecting some kind of reasoning, some kind of pushback against Jacob's entitlement. Instead, my mother gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile. "But you just bought a new car," she pointed out. "You found money for that." I blinked. The car. The car I had saved for years to buy. The car I had only recently been able to afford, and even then, it was on credit. I clenched my jaw, keeping my voice steady. "It's on a loan," I said. "And even if it wasn't, how does buying a car suddenly make me responsible for Jacob's kids? They're not my responsibility." Jacob leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. "You're the one who makes the most money," he said lazily. "We're a family. Families help each other. You've always done that." I turned to Kelly, sitting quietly in the corner, her face flushed red as she looked down at her hands. She knew this was wrong. She just wasn't going to say it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "So that's your reasoning?" I asked, my voice low. "Because I've been generous in the past, I'm obligated to do it forever? And if I don't, I'm a loser?" Jacob smirked. "If the shoe fits." Something inside me snapped. I turned to my parents, exhaling sharply. "You know what? You're right. I don't belong here." I turned to Jacob, my voice calm. "Enjoy your Christmas. And good luck with those presents. Because this loser is done financing your life." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. got into my car, and drove away. I drove without a destination, my grip on the steering wheel tight enough to hurt. Christmas lights blurred past in streaks of red and green, houses glowing with warmth and laughter. Everywhere I looked, families were celebrating, real families. Families that didn't see their children as walking ATMs. Families that didn't throw people away the moment they stopped being useful. My own family had made it clear where I stood. No place for losers. Jacob had said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he had been waiting for the chance to say it out loud. I had spent years helping him, paid for school supplies, covered unexpected bills, bailed him out when his reckless spending put his family in danger. And now, I was worthless to them, because I had stopped giving enough. The worst part wasn't even Jacob's entitlement. It was my parents. The way my mother had smiled that tight, knowing smile when she pointed out my car. The way my father had stood in silence, not once stepping in to say, "Hey, maybe this is wrong." They had let it happen. They had let Jacob push me out. And they agreed with him. I had never been the favored child, but some part of me still believed that, at the very least, I was wanted. I had been wrong. I pulled into a parking lot, staring at my reflection in the darkened windshield. I looked the same. Same jacket. Same face. But something was different. I didn't feel like the same person anymore. Because the person who had driven to my parents' house earlier that day, that person still believed in something that didn't exist. A family that cared. A family that deserved my help. That illusion was gone now. And in its place, a quiet, growing certainty. I was done. Done playing my role as the reliable one. Done pouring into a well that never filled. Done being used. I looked at the bags of gifts still sitting in the passenger seat. Presents carefully chosen and wrapped with care. Gifts for children who had been taught to see me as nothing more than a provider. For a second, I considered turning around, dropping them off at the house and leaving them on the porch. Maybe the kids didn't deserve to be punished for their parents' actions. But then I remembered. Jacob's smirk. My mother's silence. The way they had all stood by while I was pushed out. I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. That night, I didn't go home. I found a shelter in the city, one that ran a holiday program for struggling families. I carried the gifts inside, one by one, and handed them to the woman at the desk. She smiled warmly. "These are wonderful," she said. "The kids will be so happy." And for the first time that night, I felt something other than anger. Because of the gifts, they would still bring joy, just not to the people who had expected them. I slept well for the first time in years that night, not because everything was fixed, but because, for the first time, I had made a choice for myself. And there was no going back. The silence from my family the next day was deafening. No texts, no missed calls, no messages asking where I was. Just nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't expected me to leave. They had assumed I would come crawling back, desperate for their approval, eager to make things right. But I hadn't. And now, they didn't know what to do. I didn't reach out either. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one chasing them. I wasn't the one making excuses, smoothing things over, pretending like their behavior was normal. I wasn't the one begging to be included. And the strangest part? I didn't miss them. Not the way I thought I would. I missed the idea of family. But not them. A few days later, Jacob finally broke the silence. He sent a single text. "Where's the kids' gifts?" "No, how are you?" "No, sorry for what I said." Just another demand. Like nothing had happened. Like I was still the same person I had always been. The one who gave without question, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. But I wasn't that person anymore. So I ignored him. An hour later, my mother called. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Alex," she started, her voice soft, practiced. "Jacob said you didn't bring the gifts. That's not like you." There it was. The guilt trip. The expectation. Like I had committed some horrible crime by not showing up to hand over things they felt entitled to. "I donated them," I said simply. Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. "You what?" "I donated them," I repeated. "To a shelter. To kids who actually appreciate things." I could hear the shock in her pause. Because of this? This wasn't how I was supposed to act. I was supposed to be grateful they tolerated me. I was supposed to beg to be part of the family again. I was supposed to crawl back. Instead, I was walking away. Her voice changed. Gone was the soft, motherly concern. Now, it was cold. "You're being dramatic, Alex. You know Jacob didn't mean it like that. This is just how he is." I let out a slow breath, forcing down the familiar frustration. Yeah, Mom. It is just how he is. And that's the problem. You're overreacting, she snapped. You're still part of this family. I almost laughed. Am I? I asked, my voice calm. Because it sure didn't feel that way on Christmas. She exhaled sharply as if I was the difficult one. You're being selfish, she muttered. You always do this. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't a conversation. It never had been. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She was trying to pull me back in. And I wasn't going. I hung up without another word. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. Because I had finally realized something. I wasn't the problem. They were. And I was done making excuses for them. The thing about family is that they expect you to fall in line. They expect you to play the role you were assigned, the one you've always played. And for years, I had done just that. I was the reliable one. The one who gave without asking for anything back. The one who never caused problems. But now I had stepped out of line. And they weren't going to let that slide. The calls kept coming. Not just from my mother, my father, my aunt, even my grandmother, who hadn't spoken to me in months. Each message carried the same tone. Alex, we need to talk. Your mother is very upset. We just want to understand why you're acting like this. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one of them apologized for how I had been treated. Because to them, I wasn't the one who deserved an apology. I was the one who needed to be put back in my place. Jacob never called. Of course, he didn't. Jacob didn't need to. He had my parents fighting his battles for him, smoothing over the damage, making sure I was pressured into forgiving him. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. So I did the only thing I could. I blocked every single one of them. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because I knew, deep in my bones, that if I let them keep pushing, they would wear me down. They would find a way to twist the narrative. Make me feel like I had been the one in the wrong. And I wasn't going to let that happen. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life, there was no noise. No expectations. No guilt. Just freedom. And I thought that was it. I thought I had finally gotten away. But I had underestimated one thing. Jacob had never learned how to live without me. And now? He was about to learn the hard way. For a while, the silence held. I had cut them off, blocked their numbers, and removed myself from their orbit. And for the first time in my life, I felt weightless. No more guilt. No more obligations. No more being the person they called only when they needed something. It was peaceful. But peace, and my family, never lasted long. It started with a text from an unknown number. You think you can just walk away? You're a joke. I didn't need to guess who it was. Jacob. He had never reached out before, had never needed to, because our parents had always done it for him. But now that I had cut them off, he was on his own, and he wasn't handling it well. A week passed, then another. I barely thought about him, until I got a call from a mutual friend. Hey, man, they said cautiously. Have you talked to Jacob? I frowned. No. Why? There was a pause, and then. He's struggling. I said nothing, because of course he was. For years, Jacob had been living off of me. Every emergency, every financial crisis, every bad decision, he had always had me to fall back on. And now? That safety net was gone. I should have felt bad. I should have cared. But all I could think about was the way he had looked at me on Christmas. The way he had smirked when he called me a loser. The way he had never once considered what I had done for him. Jacob had expected me to keep playing my role. And now that I wasn't, his entire world was crumbling. Another week passed. Then, out of nowhere, an email. Not from Jacob. From Kelly, his wife. I stared at the subject line for a long time before opening it. I know you don't want to hear from us, but please, we need to talk. And for the first time in weeks, I hesitated. Because Kelly had never been like Jacob. She had always been quieter. More reasonable. I had always wondered if she saw how entitled he was. And now? She was the one reaching out. I didn't reply. Not right away. I needed time to think. But deep down, I already knew. Something had changed. And whatever it was, Jacob wasn't the one in control anymore. I stared at Kelly's email for a long time. I wasn't surprised that Jacob was struggling. I wasn't surprised that he had sent his wife to do his dirty work. But I was surprised that she had actually done it. For years, Kelly had stood by his side, quiet, complicit. I had wondered if she really agreed with him, or if she just didn't know how to speak up. And now? Now, she was the one reaching out. Which meant one thing. Jacob had lost control. I finally replied. Not because I owed them anything, Not because I cared about what was happening to him, but because I was curious. What do you want to talk about? Her response came within minutes. Can we meet in person? Please. I hesitated. Meeting them meant opening a door I had already closed. But something told me that whatever was happening, it was bigger than just Jacob being broke. So I agreed. One meeting. Nothing more. We met at a small cafe on the other side of town. A neutral place. Somewhere that didn't hold memories of my family. When I walked in, I spotted Kelly immediately. She looked different. Not polished, not put together like she usually was. She looked tired. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about money. Something else had happened. She wasted no time. Jacob is spiraling, she said, stirring her untouched coffee. He's drinking more. Staying out late. He's not the same. I stayed quiet, waiting. He's lost his job, she continued. Again. And we can't afford the house without his income. I exhaled slowly. So you want me to help? She flinched. No. I mean, yes, we need help, but that's not why I asked to meet. I frowned. Then why? She swallowed, looking down at her hands. Because I think I finally understand what you've been dealing with. I didn't expect that. Kelly had always stood by Jacob, had always defended him, had always played her part. But now, she was sitting across from me, admitting that she had been wrong. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. She told me about the past few weeks. How, after I left, Jacob had unraveled. How he had blamed everyone but himself. How he had refused to accept that he was responsible for his own problems. How he had expected her to pick up the pieces, the way I always had. And when she couldn't, he had turned on her. I should have felt bad. I should have wanted to help. But all I could think was, this is who he's always been. The only difference? Kelly was finally seeing it too. Kelly was unraveling right in front of me. I could see it in the way her hands trembled around her coffee cup, and the way her voice wavered when she spoke. Jacob had always been entitled. That much I knew. But what I hadn't realized was how much worse he could get when he lost control. And now, without me as a safety net, he was dragging everyone else down with him. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. So what do you want from me? She exhaled sharply. Nothing. I raised an eyebrow. That's the truth, she insisted. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking you to fix anything. She trailed off, shaking her head. I just needed to say it out loud. I needed you to know that I get it now. I studied her face, searching for any sign of manipulation, any trace of the same expectation I had always seen in my family's eyes. But it wasn't there. She wasn't lying. She wasn't playing a game. She was just tired. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, staring down at the dark liquid. I used to think you were selfish, she admitted. That you had all this money and just didn't want to share it. That it was easy for you to walk away. I stayed silent, letting her speak. But now I see it. She let out a hollow laugh. Jacob doesn't care about anyone but himself. He never did. And she shook her head. I let him convince me that you were the bad guy. Something inside me shifted. Because she wasn't just apologizing. She was breaking free. I tapped my fingers against the table, considering my next words carefully. What are you going to do? I asked. She sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't know. I can't keep doing this. I can't be his crutch. She hesitated, then looked up at me. I want to leave him. For the first time in the conversation, I was genuinely surprised. Jacob and Kelly had always seemed inseparable. Not because they were in love, but because she had always enabled him. But now? Now, she was done. I nodded slowly. You should. She blinked as if she hadn't expected me to agree so quickly. You don't have to stay, I said simply. You don't owe him anything. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Yeah, she whispered. I know. She sat with that thought for a long moment. And then, she smiled. A small, sad, freeing smile. Because, for the first time, she finally believed it. Kelly left Jacob 2 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming match, no messy public fallout. Just a quiet decision, a bag packed in the middle of the night, and a goodbye note left on the kitchen counter. And just like that, Jacob was alone. I found out through a mutual friend. She's gone, they said over the phone. She moved in with her sister across town. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't sad. I just felt done. Not in the way I had before, when I had cut my family off, when I had walked away from Christmas with no intention of coming back. This was different. This was final. Jacob reached out once. Not a call. Not a long-winded apology. Just a text. You happy now? No ownership. No regret. Just anger. Because to him, none of this was his fault. It never was. I didn't reply. I didn't owe him a response. I didn't owe him anything. For the first time in my life, I wasn't his backup plan. I wasn't his safety net. And the best part? I didn't care what happened to him anymore. The weeks passed, then months. My parents tried reaching out and testing the waters, but I didn't engage. I had spent years bending over backward for them, trying to earn a love that had never been unconditional in the first place. But now, I had something I had never had before. Peace. And I wasn't about to give that up. One day, I got a call from Kelly. Not a request. Not an apology. Just a simple, unexpected thank you. For what? I asked, confused. For showing me that walking away was an option. I sat with those words for a long time after we hung up. Because she was right. Jacob had never expected either of us to walk away. But we had. And now? We were both finally free.